discussion on surviving the recession, where to invest, where to make changes, and where the opportunities are. I'm going to hand over in a second to our chair, Zoe Amar, to introduce herself and the rest of the panel. First, though, we have a brief poll just to ask you if you're planning to, as a representative of the NFP sector in your organization, planning to invest in digital over the next year or so, or really hunker down and do your best to save money without investment. So we'll just hand over to that and then to the panel. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much for running that poll. So hopefully that gives you some food for thought, and we'll be able to start having a look at those insights later. Welcome to this panel. I'm joined by three experts who I'll introduce in a moment, and we're going to be exploring this very meaty topic, and I think absolutely key for the next few months as we move into this next phase of the recovery phase, as it were, given that we've obviously had many challenges to deal with as a sector as we recover from the initial impact of COVID. So today we'll be looking at how the sector can survive the recession, and critically, and leading on from that poll that you've just seen and participated in, where and how to focus, where we should be investing, and where there is potential for innovation. And we've seen some great examples of innovation across the sector over the last few months. So I'm joined by three fantastic panelists. We're joined by Katie Boswell, who's Associate Director of Strategy and Leadership at New Philanthropy Capital. We're also joined by Jonathan Chevalier, who's CEO of Charity Digital Trust, and Pearl Mentzer, who's Director of Membership and Professional Standards at the Royal Aeronautical Society. So we're going to be starting by hearing a little bit about where all the different panelists see some of the trends that they have seen unfolding over the last few months. And I think it's great that we've got them here today because it's three very different perspectives. So I'm going to ask them to summarise in 2 minutes about some of the key trends that they've seen playing out across the sector. And we're going to be going quite broad with this, looking at the impact on end users, so beneficiaries and supporters, but also wider use of digital across the sector, and also the impact on strategy and decision making. So I'd like to start with Pearl. Pearl, perhaps if you can give us a quick summary of some of the on end users, trends that you have seen, but also wider use of digital across the sector, and also the impact on strategy and decision making. So I'd like to start with Pearl. So Pearl, perhaps if you can give us a quick summary of some of the I work in is professional engineering. Which means that we are not just a charity, but we are also a professional membership body. So we award qualifications, as well as working with our branch network, young people, etc. Some of the trends that we've been particularly seeing is, and this will be the same across the piece, a growth in webinar use, more increased communication, which means how we communicate across those digital channels is hugely important. And also the demonstration of value and how we're able to do that digitally. There's a real need for engagement and community. And I really think that what we really need to do is think about using digital in order to continue to do that, using digital strategies in order to increase participation, which will ultimately lead to a greater sense of belonging within our membership communities and the dissemination of knowledge.
our strategic objectives remain unchanged, and we will be using digital in order to help us achieve that rather than the other way around.
Thank you, Pearl. That's really interesting, and I love that emphasis on the co-creating what you do next with the people that your organisation is trying to serve. Thank you, Pearl. So now perhaps we can go to Jonathan. And Jonathan, obviously there's so much interesting work that Charity Digital are doing, looking at digital trends across the sector. What have you seen over the last few months?
Yes, thanks, Zoe. Yeah, it's really fascinating at Charity Digital because we're both providing charities with access to discounted and donated technology, and also publishing loads and loads of content which is based on what we're seeing happening in the sector overall. Obviously, Pearl's already touched on the what I'll kind of call the forced changes, which were where people had to do more things with remote working, communication over things like Zoom. So we're now looking at the second wave of what's actually building on top of that. We're certainly seeing people starting to think more about how they join their services up. So maybe before you'd started to do your webinar sessions using Zoom or Teams or whatever to have online discussions with beneficiaries or meetings as well. But in terms of joining up, they're actually looking at things like, well, how do I do diary management electronically as well, so that it's not just a standalone island? But then you start to move into the next thing as you start to use more digital services where you do have more and more islands of data. So how you actually join those islands up, and a lot of people are thinking about that because you get a lot of efficiencies as you start to do that. And I guess kind of sitting behind all of that, we're definitely seeing a lot more interest in people engaging strategically with the subject of digital. You know, for me, this was the opportunity. COVID forced a really unpleasant change. And I really wanted to see people then actually reflecting on that learning and going forward. And we're seeing that really evidence. I've actually got a webinar later today on digital strategy, and we've got over 700 people booked on that, which is just a phenomenal response. And I think shows how much people want to engage strategically with this to help them achieve their aims, both in the short, medium and long term.
Thank you, Jonathan. That's fascinating and very much builds on what Pearl was saying there as well about remote working, those new ways of working, and also how we can all do more with data and think more strategically about digital. So building on that point about strategic thinking, Katie, obviously you have a huge amount of expertise from your work at New Philanthropy Capital on more broadly what's happening in strategy across the sector and how charities are making decisions. So it'd be brilliant to hear your summary of some of those key trends that you've seen in that area since the pandemic began.
Thanks, Zoe. And these are tough times for many in the charity sector. In our work with the leaders across the sector, we see that many are having to make difficult decisions in short timeframes and in a wider context of deep uncertainty. So many are rapidly adapting their strategies, the way they deliver their services, and how they engage with their communities. At NPC, we always say that social impact for people and communities needs to be at the heart of decision making, and that is just as true in times of crisis. It is important to base your decisions on the issues that your members, service users, and communities are facing, and the impact that you think you can have on them. We have seen a lot of innovation and creativity in response to the initial crisis, from homelessness charities supporting people in new accommodation settings, to local charities for older people, moving from running lunch clubs to delivering food parcels. We're at a point now where many communities are moving from short-term critical need to longer-term issues, such as dealing with the recession or tackling the deep-seated inequalities that have been highlighted by the virus. And we think that charities need to focus their work and their future investment accordingly. This means thinking openly and creatively about how you can best achieve your mission in the new world we find ourselves in. It means looking at the issues that people and communities are facing and how you can best use your resources and capabilities to work alongside them. It might mean focusing on a tighter core offering. Our State of the Sector research found that charities were overstretched before COVID-19, and we know that many have taken on additional activities since. You may have services that are no longer relevant, or that never delivered as much impact as you hoped. Now is the time to be honest with yourself about that. It might mean working differently with other organisations. At this time, it's important to remain open to alternative ways of achieving your mission and to look outward to see who you might partner with. NPC has long pushed for more strategic partnerships and even mergers between charities, where this will help them to collectively achieve more for their cause. So now is the time to ask yourself if you could deliver greater impact through working differently with others, or even joining forces in a merger. At this time of crisis, I believe that the boldest leaders will remain open, look outward, and put social impact at the heart of their decisions. Thank you.
Thank you, Katie. So that notion of collaboration is key to developing people's strategies and how they support people for the long term, but also key to getting greater traction from digital across the sector. So thank you to our three panellists for some fantastic opening insights, giving us some great food for thought there. We're going to go into a bit more of a discussion in a moment, but before we do that, I thought I'd share the results of the poll with you, which I think gives some very useful context. So in terms of investment in digital, we have more people are planning to invest in digital, more at 70%, which is higher than I thought it would be, which is very exciting. Less is 4%, and currently 26%. So really heartening to hear that there's going to be some greater investment in that area. So looking forward to digging into that a bit more with the panel, as well as some other questions. So a big theme which came across through all of your opening statements there was very much about how we can stay close to beneficiaries and supporters and gather insights from them. Obviously, people have been through such a huge time of change at the moment. How can we best stay close to our end users and find out how they are using digital or not using digital, even at such a time of huge change? Pearl, could we start with you and your thoughts on that issue?
Actually, we got personal by picking up the phones. Really, we continue to speak to people. We picked up the phones to members that were still to pay their subscriptions to find out how they were doing, what impact they'd had. We're a smaller professional body, and while we have a small staff team, we have a mountain of volunteers to help assist with that process. So we picked up the phone, we asked questions, and we really had an opportunity to find out how people were being impacted individually by the pandemic, how they saw the state of the industry. Aviation and aerospace, as you're all aware, has been heavily affected, and I think it was a really, really good time to do that. Speaking to our members is something that's always been important to us, and there are a variety of ways that you can do that. But in going digital, I think we need to not forget that the personal touch can lead to more digital engagement. It gave us the opportunity to kind of highlight ways that our members and our volunteers could continue to engage with us and see the value in what we were doing.
Brilliant. I love that use of the trusty phone there. Sometimes the old-fashioned methods are the best, aren't they? And if that's the best channel for people, then that's a good thing to do. Jonathan, do you have any thoughts on that question about how you can do that kind of research at a time that is still relatively chaotic?
Yeah, I totally agree with Pearl. Nothing really replaces talking to people as the start point. But I think then building on top of that as well, it's kind of test out some new ideas with people. So what people say they want or do actually doesn't always concur with their behaviors. Maybe people don't actually realize what they do. So you can actually go a long way by testing out new ideas and concepts and seeing how those work. And then actually analytics. So things like Google Analytics can give great insights into how people are actually using your digital services. Depending on what those digital services are, you might be able to produce more data as well. So actually start to dig into what people are really doing when you give them opportunities to interact digitally, and use that insight to then help you shape further services, amendments, and evolution of those services.
Great. Thank you, Jonathan. Absolutely. No substitute for having those conversations with people at the moment, are there? I can see we've already got lots of questions coming in, so we'll just spend 5 more minutes talking through a few more issues as a panel before we go to those wider questions. Thank you so much to everyone who's already sharing those. Katie, obviously you're a real expert in decision making and how charities need to consider that as part of their strategy. Are there any particular principles around decision making that you use at NPC which you think could be especially relevant or perhaps even adapted for how charities need to make decisions about digital from here?
Yes, I completely agree with what Pearl and Jonathan just said about the importance of conversations and listening to members and service users. We would say you want to take all of those insights and think about other insights that you might get from other sources. So look at sector-wide sources. For example, NPC has published data on coronavirus and how it's affecting different communities, working in partnership with charities like Turn to Us to explore the data that they're seeing in their benefits calculator about which groups and communities are affected. And that can help you to think, are there any gaps in the conversations or the data that I've got from inside my organization, and really feed into the kinds of decisions that you're making. In terms of making strategic decisions, we always say it's important to balance three things. So your core purpose, your mission, which is what you're trying to achieve, needs to be balanced with your understanding of the external environment, which is what you can get from all these different data sources and from listening to your communities. And that in turn needs to be balanced with your understanding of your resources and capabilities. And that's where I think this question of collaboration comes in, because you might realize that actually, in order to respond to the needs that you're seeing, you don't have all of the capabilities that are needed. And either you can choose to invest in those in-house, or you might choose to think about working in partnership with somebody else.
Absolutely. So those partnerships and perhaps how you make decisions as partners together are absolutely vital. We've got so many questions coming in. I think we'll go straight over to the questions now. Brilliant to see you. Thanks so much to everyone who's been sharing those. There's a wonderful question here, which is about what are the key parameters which a non-profit needs to determine where to invest most successfully. Jonathan, I have a feeling you're going to have some thoughts on this.
Yes, yeah, it's actually a really huge question with a massive answer, because for me, your investments should be strategically driven. So it needs to be appropriately prioritized against what you are trying to achieve as a charity. So I'm just going to try and really paraphrase what would normally be lots and lots of activity to get to that strategy, and say that for me, I've got two key parameters I consider. So parameter one is impact. So how is that both impacting your beneficiaries? It might be financial impact, which affects your sustainability as a charity as well. And it could actually be risk as well. So reduction of major risks to your organization. So all of those are aspects of impact, which I think are really important to consider in some depth. Against that, I consider cost and resource. So how much is it actually going to cost to progress a certain initiative? And at the end of the day, what you're going to want to pick are those initiatives which are the highest impact and the lowest cost. You're going to want to avoid the opposite of that. And then there's kind of tactical decisions you can make around kind of mid-impact, mid-cost as well. But there's a great framework you can draw out about that. I'm actually going to be talking about it a little bit more later in our webinar today.
Oh, very good, Jonathan. Excellent. Well, if people haven't signed up for that already, then do take a look at that. Excellent. So some really interesting thoughts there. How you Hello everyone. I'm not quite sure what happened there. I had a message at this end saying the connection to media server has been restored. So I suggest we just persevere. Pearl, I'm so sorry. You got interrupted in full flow there. There was a question about maintaining service delivery versus some of the kind of challenges that you'd be facing at the moment. And I think I was just asking whether that resonated with your experience. I imagine it's a very common situation for charities over the last few months. Can you share something of your perspective on that?
Absolutely. I've already alluded to the situation currently for aerospace and aviation. We are currently undergoing a restructure, but as a membership organisation, we need to make sure that we are still serving our members. And so I'm sure many in the audience will recognise that we have made sure that we've had to keep communicating with our members, giving them opportunities to participate and contribute. You would have heard in the news organisations contributing to the production of ventilators during the pandemic, and we made sure that we pushed out lots and lots of messages for our corporate partners and our members to understand in different ways that they could assist. Touching on Jonathan's point about looking at impact, there are lots and lots of ways that you can provide value and impact that doesn't necessarily need to be as resource intensive as we previously would have imagined. We've had to be quite quick in our thinking, quite agile, and understanding what our real resource is for the society. One of our major resources are our volunteers, are the people who are our members, and we have galvanised them to engage with other members in different ways. Normally at this time of year we would be having a young persons conference. Instead, we have got that conference going online over a period of days, and actually getting our members more and more involved. So thinking back to the strategy and the things needed to resource that, I think people have to be quite creative, looking at their processes and actually saying, do we need to do all of this? Getting the little things right, making sure that before we move on into the brave new world, actually are all our user journeys, our customer interactions as efficient as they could be? Where do we start to close some of those gaps so actually we make these new experiences as best as they can be?
Brilliant. Thank you, Pearl. So that notion of creativity is so important, isn't it? And doing what you can with some of those limited resources. I think that builds very nicely on a question which we've also had about innovation and examples of new things that organisations have been forced to try because of COVID. Katie, have you seen any particularly striking examples of innovation across the charity sector since the pandemic began?
I mean, certainly a lot of organisations have had to completely rethink what they're doing. On the topic of digital, there are charities like The Big Issue, which realised its street vendor model didn't make sense in the context of empty streets. So they went completely online only for the first time. And it seems that they were pretty successful at that, got a number of new digital-only subscribers. For us at NPC, we found we've had to rethink a lot of our day-to-day research work, facilitation work. A lot of my work is facilitating strategy workshops with people. And in some senses, it's relatively easy to just go, right, well, we'll take those online. The tech bit is usually quite straightforward, but actually the challenge is thinking around the relationships and the quality of the conversations. So you don't want to take a full-day workshop and put it online. We all know the problems of Zoom fatigue. You have to think about how do we break up that conversation into smaller, more bite-sized chunks. And similarly, a lot of the charities that work directly with the public and with communities are finding similar issues. So what does it actually mean in terms of relationships and engagement to change the method of delivery? And of course, necessity is the mother of invention. We have seen a lot of innovation, and much of that is to be welcomed. Much of that will stay and remain. I guess because in my work, I work with both charities and funders and often in the issues between them. One of the concerns that we have seen is around whether funders will be understanding of the need to reintroduce more face-to-face, more intensive delivery of services. So we have heard some charities that have said they've had pushback from funders saying, you did this service much cheaper during COVID-19 by getting rid of all your face-to-face stuff. Now, why don't you just continue with that? And I think there's a real challenge for charities ahead to make the case for what is the best blend of digital and face-to-face service delivery for them going forwards. It's not going to be simply one or the other. It's going to be a mix. They need to work out what works best for the people and communities that they work with and be able to make that case to funders.
Absolutely. I think that point there about the blended model is really key, isn't it? And making sure that we bring funders with us on the journey. Thank you, Katie. We've got some more questions as well, and really building on that point there about innovation. And given that we've got a few minutes left, I'd like to ask each of the panel to share. There's a lovely question that we've had in about the new things that everyone's organisations have tried during this time of innovation and experimentation. So Jonathan, shall we start with you? Perhaps if you could share some of the new things that Charity Digital's tried and what you've learned from them.
So there's quite a few things. I guess one of the big things, we're a very digital organisation anyway, but we've been evolving our model of what I call digital events, so entirely virtual conferences. And okay, as a concept, it's not entirely new, but I think the interesting thing, and it builds on Katie's point really, is how you then reimagine how you put that type of event together so that you're not just kind of lifting what you previously did face to face and replicating that over an online channel, because it kind of doesn't work really. So the key considerations are how you keep people's energy levels up through a day. So we kind of, at our last event, we had 45-minute slots, and then we had what we called a little energizer session, which was like a few minutes video, and then we gave people a break, and then we brought them back. So we kind of use that to kind of keep the momentum and the pace up through the day. Also, how you bring that element that people really value online, which is networking. So we all know when you go to a conference, you get to meet lots of people and you have a lot of really interesting conversations. And initially how people have approached events online, that hasn't been there, that opportunity hasn't been there. So you have to invent new ways of doing that. So our next event we've got coming up October the 15th on digital fundraising, we're actually setting up a whole channel, which is going to be a networking channel that's going to be running in parallel to the main event through the day, and we're going to facilitate that. We don't know if it'll work. You know, some of this is experimentation as well, and that's a really important point. When we transfer services online, we won't know what's going to work. What we need to do is we need to experiment, evolve. Some things will work, some won't. But by doing that over time, we will eventually get to some models which are really fantastic and aren't what went before at all, but don't lose any of the key elements that went before either.
So I think for us, following on from Jonathan, we're going virtual with our conferences for the first time, so fully virtual. And interestingly enough, it is that networking piece that we think is going to be challenging and also very interesting. However, we feel that there's been positives with that. You know, we're giving introverts a chance to network in a way that maybe they haven't been able to network. Our reach will be wider, and like you said, there's nothing new under the sun, but I think we're repurposing and pivoting.
Brilliant. And Katie, could you very briefly share a quick message for delegates about trying new things at this time?
Yeah, very similar to Jonathan and Pearl, we're also taking all of our seminars and conferences online. And I think one of the real benefits for us has been increasing our reach. So whereas before we've always had to travel around if we wanted to do seminars in different cities, now we're actually able to bring everyone together in one seminar. And that's been a real positive for us. So yeah, a silver lining to the cloud of not being able to see people face to face.
Absolutely. Great. Well, thank you so much to our panel. Absolutely, I think there's some huge opportunities for greater collaboration across the sector together and to bring people together. Huge thanks to Katie, to Pearl and to Jonathan for sharing their insights. And I think we now need to ask delegates to move across to the Q&A with Chris Akabusi. So thank you so much.